Okay, here's my setup. I have my palette here, and this is my paper. I've drawn these circles just using a quarter, and I just traced the circles out for later on. You can divide your paper into 4 squares. This is actually 4 squares, but we're only going to use 2 today. And the first thing I want to show you, and I'm going to do it first because it takes a little while for it to dry, is the maskoid. So I've taken this art masking fluid or maskoid or whatever they call it different things, and I've put some in the cap of the bottle, which is this. This is really old, and I'm using an old brush that I don't care about because this stuff will ruin your brush. Now there are some tricks to it. What you can do is put some ivory soap on the brush head first, and then dip it into the maskoid, and that will keep the brush from being ruined. But because I scrub so much, I end up ruining brushes a lot, so I just save them for this purpose. Anyway, so I've just done a quick little pattern on the white of the paper, and as you can see, it's a little bit yellow, and that shows me where the maskoid is. And I'm going to give that a minute to dry, and what I'm going to do is just wet my brush, and I'm going to grab a blue, and I'm just going to make a square. Keep grabbing the blue. I wet my brush first, and I'm just going to make a square of this blue. This is a peacock blue. It's a great color, especially down here in the tropics, but anywhere it's a great color. So you just lay that in while it's wet, and then while it's still wet, I just take a pinch of salt, and I'm going to throw it down onto the paper. And I'm just going to let that do its thing. So eventually that's going to dry, and you'll see what happens towards the end of the video. Now, let's take that same blue. We've given the maskoid time to dry, and I'm going to stick with the same color because I don't want I want you to see the differences that we can work with here. So the maskoid, I'm going to go right over it. I don't have to worry about being careful about touching it or any of that stuff. I'm just going to go right over it with the blue, and I'm going to let it dry. So at the end of this video, we'll pull, when it's completely dry, we want the paint to dry. Once that's dry, we'll pull up that maskoid, and you'll see what happens. So these are all kind of textural things. A lot of artists, and me, I've done it as well, is if I'm doing a still life with a tablecloth, for instance, and it has a pattern, I may use maskoid to mask out that pattern and put in the darks first, and then with just a wet brush, I'll go over it. And just to soften it, and it'll leave that pattern. And I'll show you what I mean when this is completely dry. We'll actually do that, and you'll see what I'm saying. Another way to get texture in your painting is just to make a square. When I paint, I'm right-handed, so what I do is I keep my brush in my right hand. I usually have 3 in my mouth, and then I have my paper towel in my left, and I'm constantly dapping and washing my brush. So what I'm going to do is, ultimately, I want this to dry a little bit, and I'm going to use my spritzer bottle. Now, I had a really old one that I loved, and I lost it. And I know this sounds silly, but not all spritzers are the same. This spritzer has bigger spray, so the pattern is totally different than the bottle I used to have, which had really fine spray, and it gave me a great little speckly spots. The trick is to let it dry a little bit, but not dry all the way. So it's a timing thing. You don't, if I'd sprayed it when it was completely wet, I wouldn't have gotten much of an effect. If I wait till it's completely dry, I'm not going to get much of an effect at all. But in between, you spray and you get that pattern. And the more you spray, the more pattern you'll get. And so that's nice when you're doing like a nighttime sky, snow. Same with the salt. If you want to have like a snow scene, or speckles on rocks and landscapes, things like that. When you try to create texture by doing it with your brush, like little bits at a time, or spots on an apple, which you'll see later, it becomes contrived, because in our minds we want everything to be in a row and very organized, and spots on apples and snowflakes, and they're very random. So the best way to create the illusion of that is to take out that organization that we tend to do in our heads out of your hands by using a spray bottle or throwing salt, because then it becomes a random thing. And it's even dried more. We can spray it again and see what happens. So try that at home. Now, I'm going to switch colors on you. I'm going to go to burnt umber, because from now in the next class, that's all the color you're going to be working with. We're going right into value now. So I'm dipping into burnt umber, and this is really wet, dark burnt umber because I just took it out of the tube. So it's real dark, which is good. So basically what I'm going to do is a value study, just squares. I'm going to do real dark square. Then I'm going to wash my brush, and I want to bring some water over to that puddle. And I'm going to do the next square. So you heard me use in one of the videos my staple saying, which is water is the vehicle that moves the paint. So wherever I put paint where there's water, the paint is going to go. It moves towards it. So it's the vehicle that moves the paint. So in this value study, I'm going to keep bringing water over to this puddle that I've created of burnt umber. The more water I add to it, the lighter that burnt umber is going to become. So you see how it's getting lighter? That's because I'm adding more water to it. So the less water, more paint, the darker the value. More water, less paint, the lighter the value. So again, I'm going to keep adding water just by taking my brush and putting it in my water dish and bringing it over, and then taking that water and adding a square. And I'm not letting that square before it dry. I'm keeping it wet. So there's a time frame here. You don't want it to completely dry before you put the next square in, or the paint will dry a hard edge. So again, I'm going to bring more water. And you'll see each time it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. So that's one way of creating value. Now I can just take water itself and touch it. And there you go. We've gone from a dark, dark value to a middle value to a light value. Now, I talk about pulling paint a lot. And so when I talk about pulling paint, this is what I mean. This is an example of that. So I'm going to take a real dark burnt umber here, make a dark, dark puddle. The same thing is I'm going to take that and make a square, real dark square. And while it's still wet, I'm going to wash my brush. I'm going to leave some paint on it. And I'm going to go right to the edge of that paint, and I'm going to pull it about the same length of what the square is originally, a little bit longer. Remember, the vehicle, the paint is the vehicle, the water is the vehicle that moves the paint. I'm confusing myself. So wherever the water goes, paint's going to go. So I wash my brush again, and now I'm going to pull that paint even further. And wherever that water goes, that paint's going to follow. So more water. And we can pull it down a little bit until it's completely light. So that's another way of creating value, going from dark to middle to light, just by pulling the paint with water. You can go really light to dark too. So you can take a really light puddle of paint. So this is still burnt umber, but it's mostly water. And then I'll add paint each time while it's still wet. And what will happen is we'll just go from light to dark. I'm going to keep pulling paint into that puddle. So like I said in video 1, there is no right or wrong, or this is the best way to paint watercolor. There's so many different approaches. I'm again just showing you how I do it. But these are great exercises that some of these exercises 28 years later I'll warm up by painting some orbs, which we're going to do in a minute. So again, here we go. Dark, middle, light. These are all different values of the same color. Everything that we paint has different values in it, and that's what creates volume and makes them feel three-dimensional. The best way to show you that